we have a great and distinguished group which does a very exciting thing. Whenever you bring together the hackers, the spies, and the diplomats, you know something interesting will be coming together. Right now, the topic that we're looking at is the intersection of technology and warfare. I remember when I was in the US government and sitting in the White House Situation Room for hours upon hours in a windowless room, we would often talk about the dangers and challenges from technology. And those are ones that are spread across the headlines. Drone warfare, what cyber warfare is doing to make us all less secure, and other things such as robotics, advanced intelligence, and the proliferation of technology against adversaries to both the United States as well as many other countries represented on today's panel. But one thing we don't talk about as much are the opportunities. The opportunities of what technology can do to make warfare more precise, to allow countries to execute their goals in better, more effective ways, and ways that we can try to bring about some of the most vexing challenges that our military and defense planners face as we deal with that. Some of the questions we're going to talk about today really are along those lines. How has warfare changed over the last decade, and what role has technology played in that? What are some of the new threats from China, Russia, and new state actors, and what should be keeping us up at night? How do we enlist the private sector, the engine of innovation, as we think about addressing some of these new challenges of warfare? And how do we bring these pieces together? And what should we be thinking about what's to come over the horizon? To that, I'm privileged to be joined by such a great and distinguished group. What we're going to do is start out with the conversation here, then we'll open up to audience questions, and I'll introduce folks as we move in right now. I'd like to begin with Ambassador Hank Crumpton. Ambassador Crumpton was a CIA operations officer. Then he was the State Department Ambassador for Counterterrorism. So saw from both an operational and a policy-making perspective both of these things. Ambassador Crumpton, to begin with you, I want to ask you, for technology and warfare, what should be keeping us up at night? And what should be causing us concern that maybe we're not really thinking about in the way of how technology and warfare intersects?
I think the biggest issue is the failure to remember that warfare is the most imperfect, most horrible endeavor of all human social interaction. Warfare is a social act. It's about human beings. And the technology, to the extent it detracts from our understanding of the human terrain, detracts from empathy and the understanding, the engagement with the population, I think that might be one of the biggest challenges we face. While we harness technology, indeed, to make our efforts more precise, more agile, and to eventually save lives, but we must do that while we remember that this is ultimately about people, about lives that matter. And it goes to your question about what happens next. If you secure a village or a valley, how do you win the peace? So what is the impact of your war? And that's important when you wage war. So what's the impact of the technology that we employ upon the people, and what will be the aftermath of that? Those are the questions that we must ask us, I think, every day.
That's great. I mean, at that question that you asked is, what's on the frontier of technology is really key. How do you think technology in warfare has changed since when you were in the CIA in an operational role? How do you look back over the time from where we were then to now to how things have really changed?
Well, I've been out of government for 10 years, so in more than a decade you've seen, I think, some dramatic changes. Perhaps the most obvious was in 01, 02 when we deployed at first an unarmed Predator drone in Afghanistan as an intelligence collection platform. Soon thereafter, right after 9/11, an armed Predator. And during that initial campaign in Afghanistan, we had only two birds in the air, one armed, one unarmed. But we had literally hundreds of sources on the ground. So you had technology complementing our human networks that were across every province, among every tribe in Afghanistan. Today, in some of the battle spaces, I'm not sure that that ratio applies. I think there are many more drones, there are many more technical collection platforms, and perhaps fewer human sources, which reduces the understanding and the empathy, which is an important part of war.
Right. I think what you hit on is a key theme is how do we move further on the technological curve and to think about the interaction between that and the very human element of warfare. Dr. Geoffrey Ling, if I could turn to you next on that theme. Dr. Ling is a medical doctor who also holds a PhD in pharmacology. He's a retired Army colonel, and he's the former founding director of the Defense Advanced Research Project's Biological Technologies Office. Biotech is really at the forefront of some of the issues that Hank was talking about earlier. How do you think about the role of biology and biotechnology as we think about warfare? Often two things that, fortunately, we've thought about as very separate spheres. When they start coming together, at least it starts keeping me up at night.
Yeah, I want to reiterate what the ambassador said, is that, so when we were at this agency called DARPA, and we recognized, I'd been at DARPA for a number of years before we started the biotech office to exactly explore the areas of which we are now talking about. This is something critical. So among the fundamental sciences, physics, math, chemistry, biology is the one that is perhaps the most unpredictable. Biology will always survive. Biology fights to survive. I mean, the driving force of every organism, whether it's a single cell or multi-organism, is one to survive self and survive species. So when you think about the things that could keep you up at night, those areas that can be made into offensive weapons are really very scary. A nuclear blast is very, very terrifying, but it's over in a splash. A biological weapon will survive. It will persist. It will fight that little microorganism will do everything it can to survive.
Can you give us an example of what types of things you're talking about? Just to
anthrax, tularemia, Borrelia, all these kinds of little microorganisms that are out there that there's some of the folks want to try to weaponize. Those things are uncontrollable. They're absolutely uncontrollable. They think you can control it, but they're uncontrollable. So that's only a small piece of this, right? So in the U.S., I want to be very clear here, we do obey international law. We do not develop offensive weapons. What we do is develop defense. And the idea is to deprive the enemy of a strategic weapon like a bioweapon. So we will do everything we can to develop vaccines. We'll do everything we can to develop antibiotics and the like. But that's only a small piece of this, because it comes back to what the ambassador said about it is a human endeavor. This is so absolutely true. So as we expand this concept away from just the bioweapon part of this thing, we realize that the human, what is it to be human? What is it to be a human being? You have a brain, and that brain is, in fact, what makes you who you are and what you are. Their hands, your feet, these other things, they just carry the brain around. That's all they do. So we at DARPA had started to explore the area of what it is in the human, in neuroscience. And neuroscience, I believe, is the great next frontier, absolutely. And so when you think about the capacity of your brain to think, to process, there's nothing like it. There's no in silico platform that comes close to the brain, not even orders of magnitude close. And so if we can actually bypass things like your eyes, your ears, your nose, those things put sensations in, the experience in at kilobytes per second. You process at terabytes per millisecond. So we're already seeing technology is starting to bridge that gap that, honestly, in my opinion, is going to be the greatest opportunity of the 21st century. It's going to liberate human beings from the confines of their bodies. That is, to me, huge. But there is another element to it, and it comes back to what the ambassador says, it's still a human endeavor. So at DARPA, we actually opened and started exploring the areas of the social sciences. And that, I think, is absolutely critical. Because in the end of the day, look, DARPA, we are a tech agency. We do develop kinetic things. And those kinetic things are part of our mission space. But we do recognize is that that's not always the best way to, in fact, to ensure peace, because that's ultimately what we want to do. And so we have to recognize that, coming back to what the ambassador said, I want to reiterate that point that he made, it's still a human endeavor. So we realized we had to start exploring the space of the social sciences. You know, what is it to interact with other human beings? What is it to understand, to empathize with them? Why are they in the position that they're in? I mean, the idea is not to, at the point of a spear, to force them to do this. You want to try to understand and try to work and compromise. And to do that, I think that's one area of warfare that we hadn't really thought about as much. And so at DARPA, we tried to open that space.
Right. Now, Dr. That's a fascinating point, the intersection between technology, the human element, how they come together in social sciences. And I think we've seen sort of two elements of these warfare we talked about so far. Drones and technology with the human element, biological warfare and weapons with the human element. Pippa Malmgren, I want to turn to you for another part of this element, which is economics. You know, social science, we don't usually talk about economics in the same vein with warfare, but you in your career advising some of the senior British generals right now, being a special assistant to the president on economic issues, dealing with some of the major economic crises, you have written a large amount about economic warfare and how these things transform into the future of conflict. That's something probably many of us wouldn't have been thought about. Can you tell us, what do you mean by that? And how are those economic elements transforming how we think about warfare today?
Well, let's just look at the title of our discussion, The Future of Warfare. So in December, the President and Xi Jinping signed a memorandum of understanding that prohibits the pilots on both sides from making obscene gestures at each other. Why? Because they are flying only 20 feet apart. I mean, how close do you have to fly a spy plane and a fighter jet before the guys see each other? Right, that's today. In the last month, we've had 2 episodes where the Russians barrel rolled a fighter jet over the top of either a US spy plane or a US aircraft. So this is not about the future, this is about now. Now, what is driving much of this activity, I would make a strong case that both China and Russia and their leadership, what they perceive is the US is inflicting a kind of economic warfare on them. Now, we don't have time to go into the details, but in short, they're experiencing the beginning of inflation pressures. Russians are now paying more than 50% of their income on food alone. So the Chinese look at the world, they say, we don't have the capacity to feed ourselves. We have to reach for these assets. South China Sea, in a world where we're seeing record high protein prices, suddenly 10% of the world's fish supply is right there, South China Sea. I think that's mine. So suddenly economics becomes an important driving factor in why we drift into potential conflict. Let's add technology to the picture. One thing that concerns me, my father was one of John F. Kennedy's advisors on the Cuban Missile Crisis. We all recall we had 10 days. In a world of hypersonic weapons, you don't have 10 days. I don't know how long you have, but it's minutes, it's not even days. Another piece of the puzzle, and I'll finish with this, is we don't connect the dots between economics and conflict. But in economics, we know that when you face a debt problem that's of such epic proportions that effectively it cannot be paid down, which is pretty much the situation we have today in the industrialized West, hence the effort to try to use a little inflation to get out of it. You know, what are your options? They're very limited, but as an economist, what you know is typically massive debt problems get resolved in only one of 3 ways. Time must pass, which is the Japanese style, take the pain, take the deflation, just bite the bullet for a decade or more. That's one. It's not a vote winner. It's hard to do. Option 2 is inflation, which is what every major central bank in the industrialized world is trying to do, and what the Chinese and Russians object to is we're feeling the effect of it already. And third is conflict, war, because that destroys excess capacity faster than anything. And so my concern when we talk about the future of warfare is that A, it's already with us, and that we don't recognize that some of the drivers are in the realm of economics, which people in the defense community typically don't pay attention to, and people in the business community aren't really watching strategic security issues. So they don't register that the US and China are as nose to nose as they are today.
I mean, that's interesting. So there's much more economic warfare going on right now that we talk about. So projecting in the future, if the gloves came off and things really went wrong, what would a future of economic warfare in this area of increased technology, digital currency, fast capital movements, currency flows, and really look like?
Well, let's just quickly talk about what's already in play. In the past, for example, the Chinese took their savings and placed it in the American Treasury market, which systematically pushed down our interest rates, let us buy bigger houses and more stuff in them. Now they say, okay, you've announced you want to have a little more inflation, you're not being so friendly to us with your presence in the Pacific and South China Sea, so we're not going to do that anymore. We're going to announce a new strategy called OBOR. And I'd be interested, how many people in this audience know what OBOR is? This is amazing. This is the single most important Chinese strategy for you're the only one. This is One Belt, One Road. And what it stands for is the new strategy, which is to build a physical infrastructure, which goes through 2 pathways, one through Central Asia and into the Middle East and Europe, and the other is the maritime Silk Road that would go into the Middle East through past India, for example. What we used to call the string of pearls, which was the business of building physical footholds, much in the way the British Empire did in the past. And that strategy is going to be important for the United States to think about what are the implications if the capital that China was deploying into our treasury market now gets deployed into bridges, roads, physical infrastructure, and by definition, there will be defense and diplomatic relationships and influence. And the new Asian, I'll finish with this, the new Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, which is China's institution to finance this, literally opened its first day of business larger than the World Bank's balance sheet, right? Every nation signs up. Our closest defense ally, Britain, says, we're in, thank you. And the White House basically drops the hint that this was not welcome. So it means we have to really rethink what is the nature of the relationship, the national interests, can they be aligned? And all these questions, I think, are very open. So as the Chinese say, wars can be fought with silver bullets. And so financial mechanisms, economic strategies can play a very large part, not just technology and traditional defense concepts.
No, it's powerful. And I think you rightly shone a light on the issue of two key parts in the future, both the economic warfare and how this plays out in Asia. And with that, I want to turn to Minister Nakayama, where you see firsthand what the issues that Pippa was talking about are dealing with. Minister Nakayama was a senior member of the Japanese cabinet. He's a current member of parliament in Japan and has dealt with many of these issues firsthand. Minister Nakayama, I was in Japan 2 months ago, and what I was struck by was very much what Pippa talked about, is that there is a duality between China's activities in the South China Sea as well as China's deep economic activities, which are both long-term, which leverage technology. You have a country like yours with Japan, known as being a technological leader in the world, which is one of America's strongest allies in the region. But America is very far away, surrounded by a Pacific Ocean away. As you think about both Japan's advantages technologically and also vulnerabilities, how do you think about the next few years, given the rising threats that you see in Asia, both economically and militarily?
At the beginning, I'd like to thank you for Milken Institute inviting me here. There is a Milken advisor, Dr. Kotaro Tamura. He invited me here last year also. And my English skill is not so good because I learned my English from Hollywood movies by myself. And a movie called Beverly Hills Cop 1. So this place is kind of a holy place for me. Yes. So I apologize at the beginning, okay? So, 70 years ago, what was the warfare at that time? Actually, I came here via Texas, near San Antonio. There is a village called Fredericksburg, and there is a National Museum of World War II. You should go if you have been to. Why I told that? It's very easy if it make it in sound effect. 70 years ago, war, it's kind of like this. This is a warfare at that time. But now, after 71 years later, right now, warfare is this, sounds like this. 70 years ago, we fight against nation versus nation. But the president this time, only one click, one terrorist, one IS pushed the button, and he or she could fight against a nation. So this is a very big change, the warfare. And the future, what it's going to be. Our government and we think strongly to invest artificial intelligence and supercomputers. And there is a company called Pages Computing, and there is the gentleman named called Dr. Saito Motoaki. He won the game of Green 500. Do you know Green 500? It's
Tell us about it.
Yeah, it's saving energy technology for supercomputers. I recognize that the Chinese supercomputer is right now, this present time, is the #1 in the world. But maybe the almost 100% made in United States, Intel inside, or that's a scale and the big rooms and the big the cooling system, so they can do that kind of thing. But what he made, Mr. Saito made there is a supercomputer, and into the special liquid, so the supercomputer make it really smaller, so that he's telling us within 4 years he can make extra scale computer, and also within 10 years 7.3 billion people's brain into 1.58 gallons of jar. So in that sense, who is going to grab this supercomputer? China, PLA, or Japanese Self-Defense Forces, United States of America, the armed forces, intelligence guys, people? I don't know. But this is a really, very, very high sense that we need.
No, it's powerful.
For control. And, there is a Moore's law. So once singularity happens, then automatically the AI is going to think the next AGI, artificial general intelligence, and it's going to control maybe all the human beings and also the future warfare. So that is our concern.
That's that's a significant concern. I'm already a little more afraid right now, as we should be. This will be a panel which I think will begin with sort of the nightmare, and hopefully will migrate over to some solutions. But with that, Mr. Minister, I think that an issue that you hit on very well was both Moore's law and the extraordinary power that technology advances, but also how militaries need to advance. And militaries need to adapt, not just because of technology, but that intersection between logistics and technology as well as training. I remember from my time at the Pentagon, I was struck by how many countries wanted to purchase America's best technology as the secret to why America's military did so well. But the real secret of America's military, as men and women in uniform know, it is training and it's logistics. And it is those parts in addition to technology. And I think this issue of how a military evolves to deal with new threats and challenges, but with technology, is really the question that we're getting at in this panel. And with that, I want to turn to Ambassador Juan Carlos Pinzón, who is Colombia's ambassador to the United States. Before serving that, he was Colombia's defense minister. And Mr. Ambassador, I'm wondering if you could talk about Colombia's experience and how you really successfully addressed one of these very difficult domestic problems within your own country, and how your military evolved to deal with the problem I'll let you describe, and the role technology played in this and putting a lot of these pieces, how they've come together.
Well, thank you very much. It's a great honor to be here in this Milken Institute event and in this wonderful panel. What a smart comments we have get into this panel, so I'll try just to be at the level. First, I think there's an important conclusion that anyone can get from talking about war. Unfortunately, war never gets outdated. It only transforms. And that's the thing that we always need to keep thinking about. It's very sad. Maybe other field experts will establish the reasons and the causes. But it's a fact, war has never been outdated. It only transforms. As more technology, as more knowledge, as more logistics there is available in the world, even as much freedom and democracy is available, different ways of violence and crime and terrorism or nation-state use of force just evolves into it. I think that's an important issue. The case of Colombia, we definitely are not a great power. We are a very regular emerging market country that has been moving on, but that has an interesting story. It went from being the most violent country in the world, having the two cities that had the highest homicide rates in the planet 15 years ago, by now becoming a country in which we're almost at the brink of peace from strength, peace through a political solution. And that's a little bit of the evolution. But how we did it? Well, We did it with the use of legitimate force, and I think it's important to recognize that legitimate force is very important to be linked and attached to established principles and values that are important for democracies but are important for humankind. I think that's relevant. And somehow that gives you some sense of higher moral ground and better perspective for the future. But on the other side, when you talk about counterinsurgency, counterterrorism warfare, well, the other part, the other side exactly is not using anything that looks for legitimacy or that looks for the use of the right set of standards, but on the contrary, they're trying to use whatever is available to achieve their objectives. So sometimes for people, this kind of war is more dramatic, because despite you can have resources and put more potential than the other side, some people might think you have your hands tied while the other side can do anything they want. So this is where I believe, as has happened in history along whole humanity, innovation, development, and military technology has been always, hand by hand. A lot of the innovations and progress in the world, as you know, are related to technologies that were developed as consequence of the need to respond to an actual problem. In our case, we were able to develop, in essence, 5 types of efforts and technologies. The first one, very simple one, but was air mobility and riverine mobility. My country is, just for you to have an idea, the size of California and Texas, or 5 times Germany. So we have half of the country with no infrastructure, wonderful rainforest, and wonderful plains, but in some way, those have been ungoverned spaces for 30, 40 years. So the consequence was that it was very easy to spur, related to prior Cold War era guerrilla warfare, connected to modern drug trafficking, illegal mining, and other types of crimes that are transnational. And that's how the problem evolved, and evolved to a level that they were able to fund themselves despite the end of the Cold War. So first response was, how can we control those territories? So suddenly having helicopters, having boats to go into the highways of the jungle, which are the rivers, was critical, and was very important to not only take the military, later on take the police, but also then judges, education, healthcare, and so on. And that's a thing we will need to use for the post-conflict era. That's going to be more important, because it's the only way to really connect those areas to the country. Second, intelligence. And on these, we have to recognize all the time that there were 2 countries that really contributed to Colombia: the United States of America and the UK. You came, you gave us, you enable our institutions and our capabilities, and provide us with never the technologies you use in other parts. Well, Hank will know more than I what technology you really gave us or not. But frankly speaking, for us, we're a great leap, because now we were able to locate in very far away parts of the country the presence of irregulars and criminals. Thirdly, I believe was very important the special operations capability. And on this, I follow very much your comment on the idea that on warfare, technology is critical. Whomever gets the edge is having an advantage. But whomever gets the process, whomever gets the training, whomever gets the operational art, they will use the concept in Second World War, that's where you make the difference. How to combine all this and how to make it operational very fast, very effective. Special operations were developed in Colombia to a level that we were able to reach places that no one else could, with a lot of human effort. This is very important. Humans are critical for this. But some technologies of location, of infiltration and others, allow them to really perform in a way that produce a major result. And fourth, but not least, standards. Professional standards on human rights, professional standards on behavior, on why you use force, and train and educate your armed forces onto those concepts is not a minor thing, but it's the whole difference. I will end with a fifth point, which for developed countries, for great powers, is kind of a very often or sometimes outdated technology, which is precision-guided munitions. The United States used it very effectively even during Vietnam era. For Colombia, it only came in the first half of this century, in the first half of the first decade. 2007, for the first time we were able to have access to that technology. Suddenly, that created a total change of the panorama, because we were now not only securing the cities and the roads and the economic activity centers, but we were able now to use not only intelligence to locate, but frankly to harm in a decisive way terrorists, criminals, and others in a way that we were able to move forward. I always said I can talk for hours, so I better stop, otherwise.
No, I think like that's exactly what we're getting at, is an extraordinarily difficult problem that you face with the FARC, the joining of technology, logistics, training, and using new ways to address this. But I think at the core of your story is a partnership between the United States and Colombia, and the UK and Colombia that you mentioned with technology. I guess my question for the panel is, the United States has been seen as leading a technological edge for some time, from organizations like DARPA, what we've done in the agency. Is there a danger of the United States being unseated? Who are the rivals of being the provider of either military technology or other ones? As we project forward in 10 years, should we be afraid that China will become the technological provider of choice for some of these types of questions that the ambassador had raised? If anyone has any.
I think it's a possibility, but Juan Carlos made an important point about responsible nation states understanding the use of legitimate force. And nation states, particularly commercial partners like China, understand that there are consequences if they go beyond what the world views as legitimate force. I'm more concerned, frankly, about the non-state actors, whether it's Al-Qaeda or ISIS or the narco criminals in Mexico that have $30 to $40 billion a year in revenue, and what they're able to buy with that in terms of technologies. You look at the commercial sales of drones, you look at the cyber weapons, you look at biotechnology of genetically altered pathogens in the hands of some small group that's not on our radar. That I think perhaps poses a bigger danger in the next 10 years, because they don't function within the regimes of nation states. And even some nation states, North Korea, their attack on Sony, their cyber attack on Sony, was that an act of war or not? We can't even decide what's war or not. And also going back to Mexico, in the last 10 years, 163,000 Mexicans have been murdered. We don't call that a war. A conflict that is fueled by American consumption of illicit narcotics. I don't hear any presidential candidates talking about that. $30 to $40 billion a year going to the enemy in Mexico. But we don't call that a war. So there's some fundamental questions that I don't think we've even asked, much less answered.
Yeah, I also think one aspect of this is we can become over-dependent on our technology. There are militaries around the world that are more and more systematically training without access to Wi-Fi, sat-nav, electricity, all the things we take so for granted. So the US Navy has only recently announced it's reintroducing celestial navigation, which I think is probably a wise thing, because in a world where our conflict is potentially going to occur in, for example, space, where already China, Russia, and the United States are basically in a race to see who can take out each other's high-altitude military satellites. That's what all these anti-satellite tests are about. So when you take that out, how do you drive a carrier? It's not going to do it with a compass, right? So these are interesting questions. I mean, I created a robotics company, right? I manufacture drones. They self-correct 400 times a second. Why? Because an Apple iPad contains almost as much processing power as a defense lab used to have in the old days, right? And I've literally, I can do that in my garage. And I'm not even a tech person, right? I'm not one of these PhDs from San Francisco. So if that's true, lots of other people are going to figure this out. And I very much liked your point about the biotech side. I remember reading a fascinating article a few years ago called Hacking the President's DNA. And you wonder, can we be in an environment where warfare occurs when a state or non-state actor hacks your leader's DNA and holds them ransom because only they have the antidote, right? So all our conceptions about technology being the answer also need to be flipped around. Is it also our vulnerability?
Very true. Jeff?
Well, tech is a two-edged sword. There's no doubt about it. You know, the internet was developed out of, well, our agency, but it was actually made so that defense computers could talk to each other. And the concept, Lickletter's amazing concept. I've never read his original thesis on why he created the ARPANET when he was at the agency. It's really amazing. It was so that defense scientists could use a common core computational platform. I mean, he actually built it for cloud computing back in 1963. That was like totally amazing. So, but I don't think that he thought that anybody was actually going to use it for child pornography. So at least I hope not. So, but that's the double-edged sword that you have, right? And so we democratize a lot of the technology because in it is man's greatest potential. I mean, to be able to now decode genetic chips using the Affymetrix chip, for example, that you can do it now for literally $10 for which used to cost hundreds of thousands of dollars, now opens the opportunity for personalized medicine. So that's positive. The negative side is in the hands of bad actors, of course, they can use it for all sorts of nefarious things. That's a double-edged sword. You asked a specific question, Matt, and that is can U.S. Maintain a technological lead? I think for the time being we can. For there's two big reasons for it. Number one is our educational system actually cherishes innovation and imagination. If you go to the great universities in this country and you look at how they teach their STEMs, science, technology, engineering, mathematics, and you look at the PhD programs, it's enviable. It's absolutely enviable. And they reward innovation. They reward challenging of authority. They reward challenging of assumptions. This is good things. These are wonderful things in science. The second thing is we invest a ferocious amount of money. Ferocious amount of money. The amount of money, if you add up what the federal government pours into it, the U.S. federal government and private enterprise, it's close to, and this is Congressional Budgetary Office numbers, it's close to $200 billion a year. $200 billion a year for R&D. That's more than the gross national product of Hungary. So this is just, you're talking about economics, that's purely for R&D. So when you couple this innovative reward system with the economic underpinnings of it, you're going to get advances in technology. But it comes with a price. And I'm a techno guy. I'll accept that. I'm a techno guy. And I totally believe in the democratization of technology. I believe that the internet being widely accessible to everybody has really been a major boost to mankind. I believe that the technologies associated with DNA sequencing, replications, things are going to open tremendous opportunities to treat diseases that have been previously untouched. But it always comes with a double-edged sword. I think the ambassador brings up a really excellent points on this.
It's true. I'd like to open the audience for questions from the audience about either this or other related issues. We have a mic circulating around the back. Over here.
To Minister Nakayama's point before, where eventually AI will take over and we could suffer the consequences of that. Do you think there's our human capability and our capability of restraint will keep up with that, and something like a Russian barrel rolling or a pilot doing an obscene gesture or somebody hacking the president's DNA, do you think our restraint will be able to keep up with our technological advances, or do you think at some point somebody will trip and then chaos will ensue, excluding the non-state actors for a moment? I'm just talking about like state and state interactions.
I think that AI is an extraordinary opportunity. Why would you abdicate capability like that to a machine? Why? Think about it. If in fact these neurotechnologies of which I speak and are being developed as we speak for a lot of good reasons, for medical reasons and on and on, but it allows you to now to be interactive in a direct sense with an in silico platform, that in a sense that you will have a computer that will become your D drive. that you'll basically unload this data onto that, it'll come onto you. You'll now have sensory capabilities. Your brain can do this. And as I said, we bypass the eyes. In this room, you see everything in the visible light, correct? Is there EM in this room? Is there IR in this room? Is there UV in this room? Of course there is. But think about what, if you could perceive that simultaneously with the visual, how that would change your perspective of the world that we know. It's a good thing. These are all good things. There has potential bad consequences, but let's focus on the good things. But why would you ever abdicate to a machine complete control when if you with the machine, symbiotic is better than the machine by itself and better than you by itself. I do not fear AI. In fact, I embrace it. I'm a techno guy. I'm a neuroscientist. I'm a guy recently was, at DARPA. And I know all about this stuff. And I think that it is mankind's greatest opportunity. It is a chance for mankind to become greater than what human beings were, because that's our next step. And why would you just abdicate to a machine to do everything for you and basically allow it to have runaway, unconstrained control when you with it are so much better than it by itself or you by yourself?
Actually, can I follow on this
Please,
a
Pip.
tiny bit, which is this idea that Bertrand Russell had: a nation that lets its interests get on the wrong side of its policy is lost. And one thing we need to do is understand what is in our national interest as we deploy all these tools. So, for example, if what's driving the Russians and the Chinese to get more aggressive about reaching for, fish assets because the prices have gone through the roof, we can fix this now, right? We have, through AI and lots of other technology, the capacity to grow produce now. At MIT, for example, they've created this technology. You can literally grow any kind of produce you want, no sunlight, virtually no water, definitely no dirt, and almost no chemicals or fertilizers. Bang, problem solved, next. So then the question becomes, what is in the national interest of China, of Russia, of Saudi, of Iran, and what is in our national interest, whoever we define ourselves as, and then to use the technology to try to meet and conciliate between the competing national interests. What we can't get rid of is competing national interest. And so that's another aspect of this, is just because we get AI doesn't mean we resolve the fundamental question of what is in our national interest. So we still have to think about that.
And along the way can also give us more information as well. I'll turn to you, Mr. Minister, next, and Mr. Ambassador, but one thing is what technology can do, but we understand more what it means to have higher costs of meat and other proteins in the South China Sea. We understand what types of technologies you're talking, we didn't know necessarily before. Mr. Minister?
Yes, and that is a very good question, I guess, because I totally agree with Dr. Dapa. And yes, Dr. Dapa. But imagine, describe 500 years ago, who can create a smartphone? Who met with Steve Jobs? The mistake always starts from human error, right? Credibility is very important. For example, like CIA made a Snowden issue. That's a really traitor. I don't like Snowden. I love CIA. But, so next 10 years, maybe this smartphone is going to be like this size and maybe into the brain. And then we link each other, each other brains, whole world, and no more smartphone. It's okay. It's a strong case. And so what's going on? I mean, who will control? If some IS guy, if very high intelligence guy, get into hacking the host computer to control all the brains, all the microchips, who's going to call? I mean, how to rescue us, ourselves? So I personally, of course, believe in the technology. But also we have to think about the risk. And also about the South China Sea issue. I think I am living in Japan. It's a Far East country. If the Kim Jong-un push the button, only 7 minutes to reach the missile to my house. From China, maybe within 10 minutes. And once Chinese submarine out of the South China Sea and near to Pacific Ocean. They have a JL-2 missile, which range about 8,000 kilo. So in that sense, already state of Hawaii inside of the range, Anchorage already inside of the range, San Francisco is also inside of the range, and our ally Australia is also. So in that sense, also we have to think, even this age of the time, we have to think about the geopolitics. That is also a real, the warfare.
That's true. Well, I'm glad we have the Mr. Minister. If he's Dr. DARPA, I'm thinking you're the Minister of the Future, and I'm glad we have your careful thinking to get along these very difficult issues. Mr. Ambassador, you were weighing in on this as well?
Yes, maybe 3 comments. One, the more has been presented ideas today, we're missing the word, but I think we're talking about the subject, is the whole cyber issue. And there is a major discussion about that. And of course, as much as technology is wonderful, nations, companies, people have some kind of level of risk about that technology. But I will be optimistic. Instead of denying it, I think the same smart people can counter, part of the bad intentions from criminals to nation states that are trying to affect others. Second, I think it's very important for issues like cyber, but for any other threat, to see the future very much related to cooperation. There's nobody, and it happens even to the United States, it happens even to other powers, with unlimited resources that never are unlimited. Let's start by that. You cannot impede all the threats. You cannot confront all the threats. So the only way to enlarge and confront different kind of threats, from crime, drug trafficking, terrorism, or even nation states aggressiveness, is if you really work together and really establish different layers and different ways to confront these kind of situations. Of course, there are many historic alliances in which these kind of efforts have been done, but we are on time to start discussing about this again. At least on our own region and the way we see it, Colombia has decided to make an effort in the Northern Triangle, Central America, Caribbean, and with other Latin American countries. Of course, Latin America has the big fortune not to have major internal wars among states, or not to have even nuclear weapons in the region. So we're nuclear weapons free. But we are very violent. Latin America has the highest numbers of homicides in the world. So it's somehow dangerous. So how do we confront that? Well, we're using the experience we had in Colombia, in which we were able to minimize, as of today, we have the lowest homicide rate in 35 years. Well, we're trying to spread the word and the experience in a very, not only peaceful, but very humble way to others in the region, and ask them, what do you want to use from our experience? I think it's an approach. We're working this with the United States as well. But I guess this kind of discussion, you put the level of the threat, but we need to discuss that. Going back to the cyber issue, for a country like Colombia, there's no way we can develop, a cyber security capacity on our own. Where are we going to get that technology? So how are we going to get it? Of course, we got to go and ask others who do well, who have that technology, and do it as much as we can offer other things, you see?
It is powerful. So we're building partnerships right here as we speak. Before I get to this, it's an important point, though, because it's so easy to look at either technology as there's a brave new future, it'll change everything, or it'll do nothing. And the point that the three of you raised is national interests, the typical things, play an incredibly important role through this. So it's not technology as some independent thing. It's the intersection between technology, interests, and strategy that even as we look to the future, we can't forget the past. And we can't forget the elements of history that really remain as we go forward. I know there are a huge amount of questions to go forward. Please, sir, in the front row.
Thank you. Sorry.
We have some technology to help with that.
It's a terrific panel. I'm very grateful.
So it seems that the consensus among you is that the greatest risk is from the non-state actors in the near term. And that risk is going to be more in a non-traditional war fashion of economic things that are happening, cyber attacks, perhaps dirty nuclear, perhaps biotech attacks. So in the context of that very different set of threats, how do we as a society create a framework to strike a balance between safety and security on one hand and freedom and privacy on the other?
That's an
That to me
excellent question.
seems to be a really big problem.
So great question. Who wants to take a first stab at that?
Well, I think it's an issue of intelligence, and intelligence, the value of intelligence is going to go up because many of these threats, many of these adversaries are small, mobile, stealthy, and you have to find them before you engage them, and that's fundamentally an intelligence question. I believe that if we look at it from a grassroots level, that's the best way to go. What's happened since 9/11 is you've had a great centralization of power in Washington, D.C., if you're looking at the U.S., in terms of intelligence, in terms of new departments, new bureaucracies. I think there are more than 1,000 different agencies and departments that have some role in counterterrorism right now. Deeply centralized. That's a problem because then it gets to the issue of privacy. Moreover, if you have a decentralized system, I think you can be more nimble in terms of leadership. In fact, Colombia is a great example of that. Juan Carlos is very humble himself, and one of the great things about Colombia, they had tremendous leadership from President Uribe all the way down. But a lot of that was decentralized intelligence collection and response where communities were involved. If you look in the U.S., we put an emphasis on data collection and surveillance. Well, the most effective intelligence is where the sensor and the shooter or the intelligence collector and the operational element, say a police officer, come together in a community. And we have strong communities of networks, overlapping dynamic networks that provide a form of intelligence. Community leaders, that's where you can protect both privacy but also understand those environments better and inform the beat cop as an example. There are other aspects of that. So I think he put too much emphasis on centralized power, centralized data, and we have not looked at communities, and we have not pushed that intelligence out to the community so they can make better decisions and make those choices about what's private and what's not.
That's a great point. I know we have a number of, I'll turn to Pippa and then
quickly
get
on
some
this,
of the questions.
first of all, I think in a way we a little bit give away our age by even talking about the privacy thing, right? Because people who are younger than us, they're like, what privacy, right? I mean, it's just already gone. I mean, we look at blockchain, for example, the new technology in the financial markets. There won't be any transactions over which there is no oversight and awareness. You know, they're already using the sensors from McLaren Formula One cars in the floors we walk on. They can see exactly what you do in a hotel room when you get into it. For me, mainly is getting under the desk to find the plug to put the computer. But the point is, so they know, I mean, what privacy? Is there really a privacy to be lost, or is it already too late on that front? So that's one side, but I want to be very clear. I don't think it is correct to think that we're in a world where only non-state actors are worthy of our time and attention. I see superpower confrontations, the US, China, the US, Russia, but also regional superpowers. Saudi and Iran are arguably at war as we speak. I mean, both countries striving to become nuclear powers out of our control. So the idea that the superpower confrontation problem has gone away, I don't think is correct.
No, and it's Pippa, I think it's the point.
I agree. That's the problem. You know, the conventional war, nation-state war hasn't gone away. In fact, it's more complex because you see nation-states like Russia, they're using proxy forces, they're using cyber elements, they're using many of the unconventional means, not just in Ukraine, but throughout Eastern Europe, a very sophisticated form of propaganda, subversion. So when you have, that's what hybrid warfare is, you know, a nation state adopting a lot of these unconventional tactics and also proxies. Iran using Hezbollah and others throughout the Middle East is another example of that.
You know, I think Pippa and Hank have the key insight that when we talk about the future of hybrid war, it's the fact that war, the definition of war itself has changed. You know, we are at a state of war in a sense in an ongoing way that we don't think about. The American Congress hasn't declared war in decades. We don't think about America at war typically, but we are in a zone of conflict that never before. And how we think about that is really different. I know we have a huge number of questions that we'll get through. Sir in the front row.
Thank you, David Trulio, Raytheon International. I'd like to come back to you, Hank, on the point you made about the human element and then one of your recent responses. So ideology has been always a crucial motivator for combatants. We are going to keep having the kind of counterterrorism war we're having until we confront and then defeat the ideology that drives that behavior. What do you see into the future in terms of our ability, our society's ability to counter and defeat that kind of ideology? Are you optimistic, pessimistic, or are we going to have a comparable conversation 10, 20, 30 years from now? I know you've talked about treating terrorism as a chronic disease, but where do you see that going? Thank you.
Again, I think the way to address that is very local. Also, like disease, you have to have local solutions because environments can be very, very different. There are many aspects of that, but if I had to pick one single topic, or one single strategic objective to winning the peace, it would be the empowerment of women. It's the single most powerful social, political element. Where you have powerful women in societies, violence is reduced. And I think that's a positive trend in some parts of the world. So of the many variables you could talk about, I would put that at the top of the list.
That's powerful. That's right. We'll have time for one more question, then we'll turn to members of the panel for their concluding remarks. Sir in the front row.
Hi. If AI is growing up further, I think it's possible from outside countries' people can switch on the other countries owning nuclear weapon. So if it happens, so having big weapon is itself very risky. And so on the other hand, if people start thinking the way, hey, let's dispose their nuclear weapon, and to avoid hacked their switch. So do you think it will happen?
That's a great question. Great question. Who wants to take a stab at that? I think you've really gotten to the question sort of stumps. Why don't we do this, because we're wrapping towards the end anyway, why don't we incorporate the answer to your question, and I'll give our distinguished panelists a chance for some concluding remarks. There have been a huge amount of issues here. I think really for a panel, I think we've actually driven towards a lot of conclusions. I'm really grateful for everyone's thoughts. Mr. Ambassador, could I turn to you first if you have any final thoughts?
Well, I would insist on the importance of cooperation. I would insist on the importance of using innovation and technology to respond to different kind of challenges in the security realm, and not to forget the idea of natural resources. I think the issue of climate change that was not included in our panel today is one that cannot be considered as minor. There are countries that will not have enough water some years from now and are not having enough food as we speak. And there are countries that have specific endowment on those fronts. So how are we going to balance that is another important issue to see about the future of security. But with that, I think that in the case of Colombia, we have done a great effort to transform our country. I think that the message is yes, you can. If you decide when you have big challenges, as other nations have proven. And now we have new type of challenges, and we will need to work very hard in the years to come to reconsolidate what we have done with a lot of sacrifice and heroism from soldiers and policemen from Colombia.
Excellent. Si se puede. Good.
Si se puede.
Mr. Minister of the Future.
Yes, thank you. At the end, I'd like to say thank you very much for U.S. citizens and also government and also U.S. Marine Corps, because they helped our great disaster of tsunami and also a great earthquake of Kyushu region, which affected last month. And all the troops helped more than 1,200 people from that area, disasters area. And why I said so, because the alliance between U.S. and Japan is not just a military or security reason. There is, it's a human being we fought against each other 70 years ago, but now we are really good friends. We are kind of like husband and wife. I don't know which one is husband and wife, but so this is an important thing. You know, I was born in 1970. I know the Cold War. I'm a third generation politician. My grandfather, grandmother, my uncle, my father, and I is a politician. So, you know, I never forget what the USSR is. I never forget the chasing the atomic bomb, nuclear weapons, the race of US and the USSR. And, but think, please, our near neighbors, Korea Peninsula, even the Cubans shake hands with Obama, but North Korea never shake hands with US or us. So the Cold War still exists in our region. So please understand, and please not let us stay. Please give us a future, good strengthening, and we need our wisdom to resolve all the problems on the world.
Thank you very much.
Thank
We're
you
going to
very
move into a, thank you, this is an excellent. We're going to move into a lightning round as we just finish up.
Okay. I'd
last
say
thoughts?
maybe one of the key things here is we have to stop confusing information with knowledge. We're so used to so much information, but how can it be that, in the summer of 2014, the Russians simulated a physical seizure of an island in Denmark. During the week, they hold their equivalent of a Milken event or a Davos, so every political leader on the island at the time. And this goes into the public domain. It raises the question, would NATO defend Denmark? A critical Article 5 question. And yet, how many in this audience even knew that event occurred? Could I have a raise of hands? A few, very few. So how interesting we can live in a world where defense, military activities are occurring that we're not even aware of. That maybe is a good place to start.
Amazing, great.
I just want to finish by saying that, Mr. Ambassador, you're absolutely right. The last two people I hired at DARPA before I left last December was actually a plant biologist and a marine biologist. And that's DARPA, because I believe that you're exactly right. That's the next great trouble area. But I actually have great hope for the future. You asked that, and I have great hope for the future. And the reason why it is because of the motivations. Ultimately, this is a human endeavor, as the ambassador said. But I urge everybody, when you think about warfare, take a trip to West Point. Walk around West Point and take a look at it. And what's really remarkable, will stun you, is it's not a celebration of war. They don't talk about warriors. They don't talk about bravery in battle. They talk about honesty. They talk about a cooperation. They talk about things that are not martial in nature. What they talk about is good citizenship. And at the end of the day, I think that wonderful leadership, such as in Colombia, wonderful leadership such as in Japan, in the United States, things like that, I mean, that's really what's going to rule the day. What is going to rule the day is, in fact, good citizenship.
Thank you. Mr. Ambassador, wrap us up.
I'd like to recall very briefly a conversation I had 18 months before 9/11. I was speaking with one of our Afghan tribal partners, Ahmed Shah Massoud, and he was assassinated by Al-Qaeda 2 days before 9/11. But this 18 months before, in a long conversation, at the end of it, he asked me, and we had probably 4 hours together that day, because the CIA and Massoud and his people were cooperating inside Afghanistan 2 years prior to 9/11. We'd been sending teams in, working on intelligence collection against Al-Qaeda and the Taliban. At the end of this discussion, he is very polite, very charismatic. He asked one more question. He said, I'm very grateful for your government's assistance, so don't take offense, but I need to know, does your government, do your leaders care more about finding bin Laden, Al-Qaeda, or more about the people of Afghanistan? I gave him a truthful answer. I said we care more about Al-Qaeda. It was pretty obvious. But that was an important lesson. And that's a lesson I'd like to pass along, that ultimately this conflict, not just in Afghanistan, but all the different types of conflicts we face now and will in the future, is ultimately about people. And we can never forget that.
Thank you.
Thank you all very much.
So powerful. Thank you very much, all of our panelists, and to the Milken Institute.